The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize through true mind the Tathagata. Today is August 21st, 2021, and we are towards the end of our August Zazenkai. August is the only month of the year at Mountain Gate where we do not have a 7-day sesshin, but we have a Zazenkai to help keep the Zazen going, because that's important. Mitra-roshi once said, and even when he was not at the center, when he was on his periodic breaks in Mexico, he would still sit an hour twice a day. And he said that if he didn't do that, he felt awful. Doing Zazen can help us feel much more relaxed, much more in tune. However, there are some things that can interfere with that. One of the, recently I started reading a book on what's called internal family systems, which was invented by a psychiatrist named Richard Schwartz. It's an effective means of working with trauma for people who are traumatized. And I was a little bit taken aback because in the beginning of this book, Dr. Schwartz really pans meditation, and particularly Buddhist meditation, but also Christian meditation. And my sense of it is that he's not up to date on what Zazen can do and the practices of Zazen, because he echoes John Welwood, who 20, 30 years ago pointed out that people could use meditation to make an end run around their issues, and that is true. And in the old days, when Zen first came to America from Japan, and I can't speak for the Korean versions of it or the Chinese versions of it, but when Buddhist Zen meditation came from Japan, particularly from Mitra-roshi, who was an old samurai. Well, he himself wasn't a samurai, but he came from a samurai family. It was very narrowly focused. You were basically not told specifically, but in other words, to put blinders on and to only focus on your koan, which generally was the koan move. And you were to do that in extremis, basically, regardless of what else was going on. You were to use the koan move to cut through thoughts and other things. That is a guaranteed way to allow a person to perhaps arrive at a kensho, but that kensho, will not be very well supported because the work of supporting it will not have been done ahead of time, what Toda Inchi called the long maturation. And also it's very narrow, and it makes it possible, practicing in that way, to avoid our stuff. And that's not what Zen practice is really about. Let me quote Albert Einstein, who said, "I have no special talents. I'm only passionately curious." I have no special talents. I'm only passionately curious. And this is almost like a prerequisite for those of us doing Zen practice, because most of us, perhaps all of us, arrive at practice as a means to look beyond where we are taught life is about. We often will come into this world with a sense that that there's something beyond, and there is. Maybe not beyond, but including. And that's part of the koan. Does a dog have the Buddha nature? Yes and no at the same time. Do I have the Buddha nature? Yes and no at the same time. So what then is it? Who am I really? Many, many years ago, when we were in Sesshin in Rochester, and Gordy Bruin was clearly deeply, deeply focused in the Zendo, and he had a Kensho experience. And afterwards he said, as some of you have heard many times over, why didn't somebody tell me it's about exploring your own mind? It's about exploring your own mind. And that brings us to stuff that can come up during sitting. Early on, it can simply be sleepiness. What do you do with sleepiness? Sleepiness can be a real avoidance technique. There's a sense somewhere deep within us, it may or may not be conscious, that if we go all the way through practice, we're going to disappear. And in one sense, that is true, because who we think we are, who we assume we are, this picture we have of ourselves based on what people have told us, how people have reacted to us throughout our life, will be seen through as the false image that it is. So that leaves us begging the question, if that's not who I am or what I am, then who or what am I? And it can be, as I said, a little bit sobering to consider letting go, which really is the nature of Zen practice. So we have developed many ways of avoiding that letting go. And one of the primary ones is sleepiness. And so what to do if you find yourself falling asleep in Zazen, fighting the sleep demon, as it's called in some corners. I wouldn't necessarily call it that. There are a number of things you can do. One of them is, assuming it's not a formal sitting, get up and do some jumping jacks or some aerobic activity, just a few bits of it. Walk around fast. And one of the reasons why Rinzai Zen has a relatively fast kinhin compared to Soto Zen is to enliven the practice. When we get up and move, it gets the blood flowing, it wakes us up. And that's an excellent balance to the sitting Zazen. Another thing we can do is put our head under cold water, under a stream of cold water in a sink. Or we can splash cold water into our face. We can also fill the sink, although I'm not sure we want to do that now with the water shortages, but we could take a small basin and fill it with water, cold water, and put our face into it and blink our eyes a number of times. That's also a really good way to wake yourself up. And years ago, when I was living and training at the Rochester Zen Center, in the winter, winters are beastly in Rochester. Lots and lots of snow, alternating freeze-thaw cycles that make the sidewalks deadly and the streets as well. And it's quite cold when it's cold. So the Rochester Zen Center happens to have a wonderful garden with a winding path that we built many, many, many years ago. And so I would do yaza deep into the night, which was a wonderful time to do yaza, late night sitting, when the zendo is mostly empty. It's dim, it doesn't have to be brightly lit. in Rochester, you could actually control the lights yourself if you were one of the few people in the Zendo. And so I would sit until I began to be sleepy. Then I'd get up and I'd go out and walk kinhin outdoors on that path in the icy weather. It was wonderful. Wake up, go back in the Zendo for more, and then go back out and wake up again. As we go deeper in our practice, in an extended period of sitting, often the sleepiness will wane and we'll sort of get our sea legs in it. Our body will become, well, assuming that it's morning again and it's time to get up. So we will go through a period of sleepiness often as we're doing yaza. And then at a certain point, we'll be refreshed again and we can go on. So that's it about sleepiness. We can get very dull. And that, again, is something that we have to work on. And again, becoming active briefly, fairly intensely active, can balance that out and bring us back to life again. Then there are other things, the classic things, called makyo, which is translated as devilish phenomena. But here's an important fact. We're not trying to get rid of these makyo. And they can come in very tantalizing forms. When I was going through a period in sessions where I was plagued by makyo, you only go through a period of it and then you emerge. And there are a couple of times when it happens. One is fairly early in your practice. The other is when you're getting close to makyo. I mean, close to a kensho, a satori, a moment of enlightenment. And they will often be the product of a sense of a heightened sensitivity. Rochester, although it teaches the Rinzai koans, it sits in the Soto form. And so you're facing a wall or a divider in the Zendo. And it's a blank wall, a blank divider. And so it becomes a canvas for your imagination at certain points in your practice. And I remember one time when that happened, the scene in front of me was so vivid. It was a landscape scene. I wondered, recognizing it was kind of a strange thing to wonder, if the person sitting next to me in the Zendo could see it as well. There are oral versions of that. At one point, I had the sense that I was in a restaurant with many groups of people sitting around round tables, and they were all speaking in different languages. You know, this table was speaking in this language, that table was speaking in a different language, and so on and so forth. And I could hear individual words. I did not understand the languages, nor were they any that I was familiar with, but it was fascinating. And that is what makes makyo a challenge. They are fascinating. So we treat them like the thoughts that can also plague us during sitting, which is you take a look, oh, that's interesting. And then you go back to your practice. And you go back to your practice, not shutting out, but more like withdrawing into your practice in curiosity. And this is the most important aspect of this, because if we use the practice to shut down, it's the wrong way of using the practice. And this is where Richard Schwartz was wrong in his estimate of at least contemporary Zen practice the way we teach it here at Mountain Gate. Curiosity is the name of the game. And most of us have innate sort of living koans. For those of us who need a little bit extra help, there's a whole series of breakthrough koans, one of which is the famous koan Mu. And we absorb ourselves in this deep curiosity. How can Joshu, who was a deeply realized master, say, no, a dog doesn't have the Buddha nature, when the Buddha himself said all beings do? And that was just to one monk. When another monk asked the same question, he said, well, yeah. And they're both right. And that's not something we ordinarily can wrap our minds around very, very easily. So it is the perplexity that is the most important thing in our practice. And the rest of it is like, well, you're sitting at home or in a zendo, and it's not in an isolated place, although even we are relatively isolated, but still you can hear dogs barking. We have 2 in residence at the moment here. You can hear trucks or cars going by on the road, even though it's about 700 feet away from us. And you can see here the other evening, there was a neighbor who was excited about something and yelling. And these things happen. We're not in an isolated glass-filled or glass enclosed environment here or anywhere in our life normally. And it's important not to develop our own glass bottle to live in, because Zen is about living fully, really fully. And with that curiosity, we begin little by little, if we persist, to recognize some things about our behavior, about our history, and so on. And these are not necessarily pleasant things. We suddenly begin to see a little bit more clearly our behavior. And it can be daunting. It can be embarrassing. But rather than shove that under the carpet, to open and embrace the physical experience of that uncomfortable feeling of recognizing that you said something in anger, or you, whatever it was. We've all had our moments. We're human beings. And when you do that, an amazing thing that happens is that when you own it, when you let yourself really feel it and accept that, yeah, I did do that. At the same time, there's a remorse and a regret and a sense of, I don't want to keep doing that. I don't want to do that again. And so the next time the habit pattern that fuels those things would come up, it's almost like there'd be a flashing red light saying, well, this is, you have an option to do this. You also have an option not to do this. Do you really want to do it or not? And there's space. And you can choose not to go in that direction. And of course, sometimes that leaves okay, then what? What do I do? But if you tune in, a sense of the right direction to go in comes forth. And this is another aspect of Zen practice. This is what, again, Torei Enji called the long maturation, where we are, as we are beginning to open to a more clear view of life, of our behavior, of who we might be or who we might not be, then there can be, and this happens also with Kensho. It's like, well, I remember the first 7-day sesshin I went to in Rochester, and somebody had a Kensho experience, and he happened to be a guy that my then husband and I were planning actually to go move out to Taos, New Mexico, and work with him rehabbing old adobe houses. That was particularly appealing to me. And so then Richard was going around with another older friend who had already had a Kensho and had integrated that, and said, it's like having to learn how to walk all over again. And that's another aspect of our ongoing practice. Kensho is not the end by any means. And hopefully multiple Kenshos are not the end. You've heard many times over that Hakuin, the great Zen master Hakuin, had his first Kensho when he was barely 20, and had his last one in his 50s, his 19th one. And he said he had countless minor ones. This is a model for our practice, to keep being curious. And when things come up, these devilish phenomena, to open our arms and embrace the physical experience of them, and to then continue on with this curiosity. Who am I? But also that after a Kensho, when we have seen through to some degree this self-image, and suddenly there's no apparent framework that we can depend upon to tell us how to be, tell us how to navigate society, how to survive. And that's when it's really important to be curious and open to the sensations in our body, to practice the focusing techniques that Eugene Gendlin, a different psychotherapist who was many, many years ago, he's since died, had discovered that the difference between people undergoing psychotherapy who made progress, and rapid progress, and ones that didn't, was the ones that made progress were able to do what he called focusing, which meant not the blinders on type focusing, but a tuning in, a sensing in our bodies. And when we do that, it's almost like it's a right brain exercise. We get out of our thinking, calculating mind and into a more reality-based experience. And when we are willing to remain present in that long enough, a sense of the direction to go comes forth. And in my experience, it's always an accurate sense. It doesn't lead us astray. That is a gift of our practice. In order to get there, we have to become like Albert Einstein, tremendously curious about life, about who we are, and also not trying to do it in a narrow, encapsulated way. When we do the extended out breath, that is the hallmark of Rinzai Zen practice, a phenomenal practice. And it can be done side by side with koan work. In extending the out breath, focusing on the experience of that in your body, alrighty, that is already focusing in the most important aspect of that term. Then, curiously enough, we have both a narrow, curious focus that allows the other things to kind of be in the background, but we also have an expanded awareness. And this also is important. Zen practice is not about shutting out the world. And that's vital to understand. So I hope that those comments are of help to you. And I'd like to share one last thing. This is from Rainbow Painting, it's called. The teachings of Toku Urgyen Rinpoche, who is the father, was the father, he's dead now, of Yongey Mingye Rinpoche, whose last book, In Love with the World, the Travels through the Bardo of a monk's travels through the Bardo of living and dying. It's a wonderful exposition of Zen practice, even though it is within the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And here is something from this book. Everything we perceive is made out of visual forms, sounds, smells, tastes, and textures. Look into these and investigate. Where do these arise from? Where do they dwell? Where do they go to? When we really examine them, we find there is no such thing as coming into being, dwelling anywhere, or disappearing. On a coarse level, the four major elements of earth, water, fire, and wind, and on a more subtle perceptual level, all perceived objects of form, sound, smell, taste, and texture are all discovered to be by nature beyond arising, dwelling, and ceasing. When both the perceived objects and the perceiving subject are found to be beyond arising, dwelling, and ceasing, utterly empty, everything is then just basic space. This is what is referred to as yin. In Sanskrit, the word dhatu, yin, space. Wait a minute. In Sanskrit, the word dhatu, yin and yeshe, have basic space. And wakefulness are primordially indivisible, because our basic state is the unity of emptiness and cognizance. Our basic state is the unity of emptiness and cognizance. Luminous transparency. And when we realize that deeply enough, we become free. Free so that our innate compassion and wisdom function fully. I leave you with that. I thank you very much for joining us today. Please take good care of yourselves and stay safe. Thank you. We will recite the 4 vows before we finally conclude the sitting. Shujo muhen segando bono mujin segandan homun muryo segan gaku butsuro mujo segan jo Shujo muhen segando bono mujin segandan omun muryo segan gaku witsudo mujo segan jo shujo muhen segando bono mujin segandan omun muryo segan Itsudo Mujo Seiganjo. Sentient beings are numberless. I vow to liberate them. Clinging is inexhaustible. I vow to put an end to it. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to master them. The way of liberation is unsurpassable. I vow to become it. Again, thank you.